big website. All right. So with that, again, I'd just like to welcome everybody. I will give you a quick overview of the agenda. Again, my name is Colin Hayward. I'm new to the project team. But tonight we're going to do a brief overview of the North Bethesda BRT, some of the previous tasks we've been working on. We'll go over our corridor foundations work and our termini screening, which we've presented previously at CAC meetings. And then we will start diving into a little more detail in terms of our build alternatives development. So we will look at some of the different tasks we've been working that are more specifically related to those alternatives, and then dive into some of the draft alternatives we are looking at in hopes of getting everyone's feedback and seeing what you have to think about the work we've done up till now. After that, again, we will take some questions, try to answer everything as best we can, and then we will look ahead in terms of next steps and in terms of how we work towards completing our build alternatives analysis, and then seeing where that puts us in terms of coming to more of a design solution for the North Bethesda BRT. All right. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kate, and she is going to dive into some of our previously completed tasks.
All right, thank you, Colin. One thing I did want to ask before we get into the presentation is if everyone in the chat could just write your name just to make sure we can document who's at the meeting tonight, and if you are a part of the CAC or if you're a part of a organization or agency within Montgomery County, we would just love to know who's on the meeting tonight so we can follow up with you after with more project updates as this continues to move forward. So we wanted to just start off by providing a bit of a refresher as it relates to the North Bethesda Transitway. Originally, this was identified in the 1992 master plan, which was 30 years ago. The next plan to identify the North Bethesda Transitway was the 2013 Countywide Transit Corridor Functional Master Plan. And really the intent of this plan was to identify enhanced opportunities for travel by transit to support Montgomery County's economic development and mobility goals. And then it was last identified in the Service Planning and Integration Report, which provided a more detailed service plan concepts for each of those corridors that were identified in that 2013 master plan. I do want to note that while North Bethesda is a shorter route compared to some of the other 10 BRT corridors, this project was accelerated by council due to the managed lane projects occurring on 270 to Westlake Terrace. So if you're familiar with some of the other BRT corridors, just wanted to give you a little bit of the background as to why North Bethesda is where it is in the planning process. So for the project purpose and what will come from this study is really selecting an eastern terminus from the two options identified in the master plan, which is something we have done and we'll refresh you all tonight. Another outcome is the project definition, which starts to move into our build alternatives analysis. So what that cross section will look like, where the stop locations will be, supporting infrastructure, as well as whether the western terminus, which was previously identified as at the Montgomery County Mall, would benefit from possibly further extension. And then once this project's complete, it's going to be prepared to move into design and environmental phases. So existing conditions within the study area, this was one of the first things we brought you all at the first CAC meeting. We collected all these different categories surrounding the project area to establish current characteristics and conditions. So some of these are related to the demographic, what the existing transit service is, what multimodal facilities already exist out there. There are some elements that we looked at that are documented in our foundations report, as well as they were used to evaluate potential alternatives moving forward. A lot more information related to the foundations report and kind of the current conditions can be found on the Montgomery County BRT website for North Bethesda. There's a story map there as well as previous documents if you're interested to see a little bit more of that. So during our last CAC meeting, which was all the way back in May of 2022, we presented the results of the termini screening. So this was one of the major outcomes of this study, was the master plan from 2013 identified two different eastern termini for this project. One at the North Bethesda, also referred to as the White Flint, but now called North Bethesda, and then south of that, the Grosvenor Strathmore Metro. So this was completed because we needed to identify to move forward where this project was going to connect to. So with that, you can go to the next slide, please. And so what you see on the screen here is a summary of that termini screening results. So White Flint, now called North Bethesda, had an advantage in all the categories. So we had our 6 project goals and we developed different metrics to relate back to those project goals. And really White Flint just had a really strong support for meeting a lot of those different metrics, both qualitative and quantitative, that we ran against this termini screening. Mobility choices and economic growth really were ones that were strongly in favor of connecting to the White Flint North Bethesda Metro Station. The one exception was sustainable solutions, which is really the cost effectiveness of the design of this project. That was based on the master plan assumptions, which is something that we're going to be refining as we move into this next step of the build alternatives analysis. So that was really one of the components that was a bit up in the air. So it clearly stated White Flint North Bethesda satisfied more metrics to support our project goals than the Grosvenor Strathmore Metro Station. And this is the terminus that we have moved forward with as we've begun to move into our build alternatives analysis. So one other thing that we accomplished over the summer, and this came from meetings that the last meeting we had with you all, as well as the technical advisory meeting, is we did a route screening. Because once it was determined that we were connecting up to White Flint and North Bethesda, there are different roads that can get us there in terms of BRT route. So we looked at several different factors. A lot of these were a desktop analysis and things that we were able to screen in a sense versus a full-blown analysis of which of these routes might best benefit the project to use. So we looked at 4 different options. So that was taking Old Georgetown Road to Marinelli Road via Nicholson Road, then just taking Nicholson Road over to 355, connecting up to the Metro, then taking Old Georgetown Road up into the Pike and Rose area. And then it was also just taking Old Georgetown Road all the way through to connect over to the Metro Station. So the 2 highlighted in red that you see on your screen, Marinelli Road via Nicholson Lane and Old Georgetown Road, are the routes that we have moved forward with in our build alternatives analysis to connect us over to the Metro. And then just some recommendations we're here to make to move forward is really just understanding what we've gone through. So the corridor foundations, the termini screening, we have developed some build alternatives, which is what we're here to present to you today. And we're really starting to get into the analysis of those build alternatives. So this is just kind of where we are within the process. And with that, I'm going to open it up to see if anybody kind of has any questions related to what we've previously done before we get into the meat of the presentation where we're going to talk about the build alternatives development.
See any hands up? Nothing in the chat, although I do see your comment, Michael. We will certainly note all comments in the chat. Any questions before we move forward?
And as I said too, just to reiterate, a lot of this information is available online. There was a story map created that really includes a lot more detail as it relates to the corridor foundations and the termini screening. So if you'd like to go back and kind of have a refresher, because it was a long time ago since we had our last CAC, or maybe you're new to the project, I would definitely encourage you to go there and look to get a little bit more background information.
And Silvana, you have a question?
You're muted.
Can you unmute?
Thank you. Thank you. I was trying to unmute myself and I couldn't. As you mentioned, Caitlin and Corey, it's been a while since we had the last meeting. And if I'm understanding correctly what you're saying, the North Bethesda Metro Station has been selected. It's just a matter of selecting which route from the North Bethesda Metro Station to Westlake and Bethesda Mall, Montgomery, West Montgomery.
Yes, so the North Bethesda Metro Station was determined as our eastern termini moving forward. So what we're doing now, and this is where we'll get into more detail with what we're going to show you, is the build alternatives. So yes, we looked at 2 different routes just because there were multiple routes to connect over there of which were most beneficial. But now what we're looking at is what are the different components when it comes to what this BRT system will look like along those routes to connect to the metro is what we're moving into the analysis of.
Okay, when was that determination made?
The Eastern Terminus,
Correct.
that was made, I guess, Corey, that was over the summer because we presented to the CAC and the TAG in May of 2022, and then it was presented to, it was brought to the public, well, it was brought to the public and then it was made aware to the meeting we had with leadership that that was the determined Eastern Termini based on the screening.
Okay, well, I'll just skip this question, but now this meeting I presume, or that determination I presume was made before the bike lanes were approved and implemented on Old Georgetown Road?
Yes.
Are we somewhat taking that in consideration, not in reconsidering the initial determination of on the eastern corridor or the North Bethesda Metro Station versus Grosvenor, based on the bike lanes on Old Georgetown Road that have taken now 2 lanes?
So I'll jump in, guys. So we're aware of the bike lanes. That still doesn't change the fact that North Bethesda is just a better attraction in terms of trying to tie into for transit. So we acknowledge that something will need to be, something will need to change along Old Georgetown if the BRT is to go that alignment. We're working through those details with the state, and that will be part of the alternatives analysis. That, you know, we'll walk through that in the next couple of slides, but a determination as to how the BRT would travel along Old Georgetown would be part of the alternatives analysis, and it will take into consideration what happens with the bike lanes. Do they get shifted to, say, a shared use path, which is what the bicycle master plan calls for, or is there some other configuration in the roadway cross section that could be accommodated?
Thank you, Corey. And the reason why I'm just kind of like harping on this is because my community, the LCA, which is what I represent right now in this CAC, everyone is, or most people are very concerned with the increase in traffic, and it was a sudden increase for all of us. And so the thought of losing yet another lane, it starts sounding crazy to people, right? So while I don't think most of us are against public transportation and creating more mechanisms for mass transit, we're all questioning whether this is a problem that doesn't quite exist right now, and we just have a solution that we want to sort of force onto residents. I know I've asked about ridership. What is it currently on the routes that exist, and how much of that is being used, and why we're just kind of like seems to be pushing forward with this so hard. And now the question is, you said something about it's being accelerated. So can we define what that is, please?
So this is really the first stage of any project that happens in the county. And so an alternatives analysis does include an option that's called do nothing. That may be an outcome of this study, is when we look at all the outcomes, when we look at what the future ridership may be, when we look at what the traffic impacts will be, when we look at the performance to transit, when we look at how this relates to future development and redevelopment along the corridors, we may not see value in moving forward with that. But that's why we do these studies, is we have to dig into and understand what the outcomes are going to be. There will be options that may include not changing anything to Old Georgetown Road. Old Georgetown Road may stay roughly the same way, and the transit may just operate in mixed traffic. If we don't see that performance boost with a dedicated bus lane. So in terms of, you know, this project moving forward, no decision's been made other than to study what we should do. And there's no funding beyond this stage of the current study. So at the conclusion of this planning study, these results will be taken before the planning board, and the planning board will have an opportunity to weigh in and give their input along with the CAC and the community at large. And then everything will be taken back to the council. And the county council will have the final say as to selecting an alternative and whether they want to advance funding. The decision may be, we're going to pick an alternative, but we're not ready to move forward with design. We think that this project should wait until some other dominoes fall into place before this corridor makes sense. You know, when this corridor was advanced into planning, there was a lot of momentum with the I-270 opportunity lanes, and obviously that project is somewhat up in the air. There's been no final decision on that. So there were lots of other moving pieces as to why this particular corridor got selected to move forward into planning at the time that it was. And so those things will also need to be taken into consideration when a final decision is made. But you know, there's no impending changes, at least relating to BRT, to the corridor as of yet.
Okay, not even a timeline change, just based on what you said. I remember at the beginning of this months ago, we talked about this is like 20 years into the future for implementation, right? Has that timeline changed at all?
So 20 years is how far we tend to look into the future in terms of forecasting. In terms of a schedule for this project beyond this, I can't give anything because I have no funding to even be able to move forward with the project. So without funding, we can't even take the project into preliminary engineering or final design or construction. And so those are still questions that will need to get answered at the conclusion of this. I can make up a schedule assuming that we would get funding. But I can say as a BRT program, we've got other corridors that are higher priorities right now. And so the focus is on getting those corridors through design and into construction, probably before we would even come back to this one in terms of actual construction. This one may move forward into design, but I'm going to guess, and all of this is subject to funding, that there's not going to be enough funding to try and move forward more than probably 2 corridors at a time into construction.
Understood. Thank you for answering my question.
Sure.
Appreciate it. Looks like we have a question from Jason as well. Jason, are you able to?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, well, thank you for having this forum where we can express our opinions. So I live in the Lux Manor neighborhood, and these new bike lanes have been a complete disaster for many reasons. The traffic has significantly increased. We lost a lane going in both directions, and the remaining 2 lanes are significantly narrowed. Emergency vehicles don't have the ability to pass by. There's no shoulder to move over. The merge lanes getting on and off the 270 and 495 are shortened, which makes it very dangerous. It's dangerous for bikers and cars. And the main problem that I have with the bike lanes and this new bus lane is that all it's doing is forcing car traffic to go through the local neighborhoods. We live in Lux Manor, and there's no sidewalks. There's kids playing outside. There's kids walking to school. With the new school coming, there's going to be even more people walking. And now cars are zooming through our neighborhood to avoid the traffic. And I can't even imagine if you lost another lane. I think, people need to come out here and see what's going on. It's not just during rush hour. It's all times. You can't get Pike and Rose and, almost democracy. It's a parking lot for significant parts of the day. So I hope that's considered. And I don't see how Old Georgetown Road could function as a 1-lane road. I can't even fathom that.
Yep, I appreciate that, Jason. And
oh,
sorry, did you have something else? I'm sorry.
My concern is for people in the neighborhood that are going to have increased traffic coming through, because it's going to be dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, regarding the bike lanes, as Kate noted, as the team noted, that was something that we now need to consider, since that's reality, since SHA installed them. So as we get into more of our alternatives here, you'll see how that will factor into any analysis we do, including that no build, because it has to account for those bike lanes now. And, absolutely, we hear you on safety and those issues. That's part of the metrics we're going to use to evaluate our alternatives. So we will absolutely be considering that.
Thank you for letting me explain. Yeah.
Go ahead, Lucas, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think, we're seeing a lot of questions very understandably about the new development and what will be considered. And it may help to just, if we can go through a little bit more of how we are envisioning what alternatives looks like, because I will give a little bit of a spoiler alert that there are no alternatives that are currently on the table that bring Old Georgetown down to one lane in each direction. There are alternatives that look at keeping the bike lanes like the no build or looking at bus lanes, but there are no alternatives that are currently under consideration that are one lane in each direction on Old Georgetown. So just wanted to make that clear, and we definitely have more information to share about how we are looking at the proposed alternatives.
Appreciate that, Lucas. All right, I see we've got another question from David, and then let's take that. We may try to move ahead to dive more in and take more at the end, but David, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Okay. I was wondering, what could you be possibly thinking in terms of enhancing the White Flint station? I know that Amazon has a fair amount of money available for housing. Has there been any thought to try and get a hands on some of that money? So that's one question. The other question is regarding the Strathmore station. That's going to be one of the stations on the east-west line. And the question is, what's going to be done to enhance that station in terms of its ridership? And would you consider taking it all the way to River Road, where there's another large group of homes and populations and apartments that could easily, want to use transit? So I'm wondering how much you're looking at in the future as to where the trends are and where they're going to be in terms of expanding the system, so that you are not only looking at the current situation, but the situation that's going to be in the next 10 or 20 years.
Appreciate that, David. Yeah, for the first part of your question, I'm unfamiliar with the White Flint funding you were talking about, so I can follow up offline on that. But yeah, I mean, regarding the system, I don't want to speak for more than the North Bethesda BRT itself, but one of the biggest things we're considering when we're looking at these alternatives and analyzing things are our connections to the system and the planned system for years out, because we want to make sure that things we're building that are not only useful now, but are also going to make logical connections to the system as we continue to invest in that and work with the public to get that done. So that's definitely something we'll be considering. And again, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I think as we go through the next part of this presentation, Build Alternatives, you'll start to see how we're considering some of those things, and that may help you regarding that question.
Understood.
So Vaughn, if it's okay, do you mind if we keep going, and then we'll get you at the end? I know we've got some in the chat as well, if that's okay for everyone, but I would just like to get through a few more slides, and then we can have another session if that's okay. Lucas, do you want to go ahead here?
Yep, and just want to make sure you all can hear me. Okay, it sounded like I might have been breaking up a little bit before. Yep, okay. All right, great. So to give a little bit more additional information on the alternatives and analysis that we are doing, we are going to be looking at 4 different alternatives. And as Corey mentioned, these vary on the spectrum from essentially doing nothing from what is out there with committed projects to looking at a service-only alternative that does not impact, that does not include additional physical infrastructure, as well as build alternatives. So these alternatives vary depending on a few different factors. So lane configuration in terms of how the space on the street is allocated among modes, station locations, bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, intersections with TSP, which is transit signal priority, which can speed up transit buses, and running ways, so whether that's dedicated lanes or not. And we'll show you more of that in detail in list and map form shortly. There are some components that are constant across the alternatives, so the service inputs. So looking at increased transit service levels, as well as what we call the no-build projects. So projects that have been committed to, there is assigned funding, development projects, as well as pedestrian or bicycle projects. So as we go to that next slide, and so there are a lot of different ways, configurations that can be evaluated here. And to create a comparison, to focus on two distinct ends of the spectrum here, we looked at a variety of different configurations. So we're hearing a lot of questions about what the lanes could look like, and we will show this. But what we are conveying here is that there are a lot of different options that can be looked at. So we are looking at mixed traffic options in some of our alternatives. We are looking at dedicated lanes for some portions, and different ways to achieve those dedicated lanes. So I believe I saw a question on how would, is there a widening being considered as a potential option? That is one of the options that is on the table, as well as repurposing lanes to make dedicated lanes. Again, in no scenario are we looking at just one lane of general purpose traffic on Old Georgetown Road. There may be other considerations that come up in the future in terms of when we do after we analyze our build alternatives and develop what we refer to as a preferred alternative. But these are the general configurations that we looked at. So let's look on the next slide at each of these alternatives in a little bit more detail from a narrative perspective, and then we'll go into the map perspective. So first, the no build alternative. So this includes just infrastructure and developments that would be built out regardless of if the North Bethesda BRT is implemented. So this includes development projects that are currently in the pipeline. And an example of this project would be the bike lanes that have been installed on Old Georgetown by the state. There is a TSM alternative, which basically includes increasing the service levels of transit on the corridor and potential locations for transit signal priority. We heard in the first phase of outreach there was a desire of saying, do you need dedicated lanes? Can you just increase the frequency of the buses? That is essentially what is captured in this TSM alternative. The first build alternative, what we are referring to the maximum build out, this aligns with the transit corridor master plan, as well as additional smaller plans that land use plans. This one would likely result in increased potential right-of-way impacts, but less operational impacts to traffic. The build alternative 2 also includes dedicated lanes, but infrastructure in targeted locations. And so this is from a narrative perspective. I do see a chat. We will we do have maps and comparisons of these as well. So let's go to the next slide where we compare the two build alternatives. So we want to highlight a few differences between the two build alternatives. Again, in addition to the no build and the TSM alternative, we talked about full build out of dedicated lanes in the build alternative 1. This would result in potential widening to include the dedicated lanes, where alternative 2 dedicated lanes could be achieved through repurposing. So that could be a repurposing of a travel lane, or in some cases it could be a repurposing of the bike lanes that were there and repurposing the bicycle facility to be a side path facility, for example. On the station locations, we are looking at two alternatives for station locations. The second alternative including fewer locations to prioritize transit time. The when we talk about if the build alternative one, the maximum build out becomes the preferred alternative, that is certainly looking at a longer term build out versus a shorter term for the targeted investment. From a service perspective, we would be looking at similar service levels consistent with BRT, such as providing all day service and connections to potential other BRT lines, as well as potential changes to the local service that would be coordinated with the ongoing Ride on Reimagine study. So on the next slide, we have a map of the first build alternative, what we are calling the maximum build out. So this helps to orient you here, the solid lines, the solid black lines that you see are proposed to be have dedicated transit lanes, one in each direction. The lane configurations for the general purpose lanes are also listed for both along Rock Spring as well as Old Georgetown Road. For this alternative, there is a mixed traffic segment on the eastern end of the corridor. And this is proposed to tie into the planned northern entrance at the North Bethesda station. One participant had mentioned investment in this area. One of the planned improvements that is currently in the capital improvement plan is a northern entrance to the North Bethesda Metro Rail station. On the next slide is the second build alternative, the target investment scenario. And so to highlight a few differences from this one to the previous alternative, one is an extended western terminus. You see starting from the west near the Westfield Montgomery Mall, that there was a proposed extension in mixed traffic to Westlake Drive. This would be to serve some of the apartment complexes there, as well as provide access to some of the park. So that is one thing that we are testing. There's also one fewer station along Rock Spring Drive, as well as one fewer station at the Tuckerman location. Again, to test out trade-offs between ridership and travel time and cost. Again, these are options that we are testing during this phase. It's not saying that we are proposing one or the other. We are trying to identify options to test in addition to the no build and to the TSM alternative. The next slide here shows the bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. So this shows some of the no build projects that have been included. This does reference the bike lanes that were implemented by the state on Old Georgetown Road. Again, those are considered as part of the no build alternative. However, they're not included in both of our build alternatives. It is assumed that bicycles would be handled on Old Georgetown Road through a side path configuration. There was another element I mentioned of the second alternative about the Western Terminus. So this was something that we heard from the technical stakeholders as well, with our technical stakeholders being staff from different county departments, as well as other staff from transit agencies, as well as from this group of looking at access both to the apartments as well as the park here. And so we are proposing an additional station on the second build alternative to test this option, again, looking at trade-offs of ridership and cost for the alternatives. So I know that is a lot of information. Hopefully that did help understand what are the options we are looking at. I'm happy to take any questions regarding this, and then we can wrap up some of the next steps.
Yep. Silvana, did you have a question?
I do. For those of us who are not planning road people, like you guys experts, what does it mean side path? Can you please clarify that a little bit? Because you're saying on the build out options, bikes would go into a side path.
Mhm.
I just don't know what that means.
Sure, good question. So a side path is essentially sometimes also called a shared use path, basically outside of the main road. So not like a sidewalk, it would be wider than a sidewalk, but it would have accommodations for that bicyclists and pedestrians could use.
But to just thinking of how Old Georgetown Road is configured at the moment, or, you know, as it was, let's say a month ago, 6 lanes to travel for cars. So there is a dedicated, in my mind now, future thinking, there's dedicated lane for BRT. Where is the side path? Is taking another lane, or is it on the sidewalk? Is it expanded somehow?
Yeah, so the side path would be outside of the curb. So think of more of like a sidewalk. So it would be outside of the normal curb to curb space. So that would not change what the configuration of the curb to curb travel lanes in the roadway would be. It would be more of it would be an improvement on the other side of the curb, so similar to a sidewalk.
So if I'm seeing this correctly in my head, that's 2 lanes for cars each way, and then 1 dedicated lane for BRT each way, and then an expanded sidewalk, side path that would facilitate for bicycles and pedestrians. Is that correct?
That is correct. Colin, can you go back to the map of the
Yeah.
bicycle infrastructure?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, there it is. So in front of the future high school, there's already plans to put, I want to say it's like a 12 or 14-foot wide side path in front of the school, outside of the curb. So that's why that portion is colored in purple, is it already has or will have in the future the side path. There are side path pieces already done closer to Pike and Rose. And so what we would be proposing is that instead of having the in-road bike lanes, we would complete the gaps in that side path network. So there's one consistent path all the way along Old Georgetown Road. And currently that's being laid out on the eastern side of the road. That's where the pieces are currently in place in some segments.
I understand that part. I just want to make sure that I'm clear. I would be losing another lane to this, because I know when Lucas.
No,
it's outside of the road. So
Outside the roadway.
it would be outside of the roadway. So the
Okay,
road.
so you guys are all telling us here that we are not losing another lane to BRT.
Well, none of our alternatives are proposing taking Old Georgetown Road down to 1 lane of general traffic. The two alternatives that the team has shown you tonight, one would widen the road. So we would actually be adding lanes to the roadway to get bus lanes in place. The other alternative would essentially, as you described it, it would take the lanes that have been repurposed to create the bike lane, and we would put the bike lane outside of the road, and we would take those lanes and make those the BRT lanes. And so those are the 2 build alternatives. Again, no decisions have been made on whether there will even be a dedicated lane on Old Georgetown Road. Everyone may determine that that's not something they want to invest in, and the county council may agree with all of that. So that's what we're trying to study right now.
Okay, understood. And then that possibility of road expansion, if it were to go in that direction, would the properties that are adjacent to Old Georgetown Road be then, there's some dominant domain, just to take some land from those properties in order to widen the road? Is that what
so that will be a piece,
the mechanism?
that'll be a piece of the assessment, will be what that property impact will be. and the associated costs of acquiring that property. So that'll be a component of each build alternative.
Thanks for answering my questions again.
All right. Debbie, it looks like you have a question.
Yes, and it was about the properties. Is it from both sides of Old Georgetown Road? Because we have public, we have private, we have residential, we have religious property, I mean, I was involved with the Woodward design. We were mandated to put the pathway in there as part of the bike master plan, and it goes down, connects to the trail. But so is it to come from both sides of Old Georgetown Road, or, you know, or just from one side, or is that still not determined?
And I'm sorry, just so I understand your question, Debbie, you're asking if the shared use path will be on both sides?
No,
Oh, okay.
no. When you have to
Property
invoke
impacts.
eminent domain and
Oh,
take land,
eminent.
when you're going to take land, is it going to come from both sides equally? You know, you're going to try and split the baby, or are you going to do one side or the other?
Those determinations haven't been made yet. Yeah, no layouts have been applied to the corridor to understand which side is more advantageous. And again, I've heard eminent domain mentioned. That's the option of last resort in any sort of public project.
Right.
The first thing that we would strive to is to come to an agreement
Right.
with the property, with each individual property owner.
Right. No, I understand that. I mean, we have the new Josiah Henson building that was just built, and we have all these other things. But the other thing that I wanted to ask is there are a lot of developments that have been approved based on the original Old Georgetown Road before the bike lanes were in and all of that, and before this was in. And some of those will not be built yet. Do those properties have to go back and revisit? This is probably not your guys' domain to answer, but I'm assuming no, once they're approved, they're approved.
That is correct.
Yeah, so we're stuck with whatever it is based on, yeah. Okay, thank you.
But the traffic, what I can say is the traffic analysis that we're performing will account for not just those that are approved, but future land use growth as well. So we are forecasting out into the future.
So are you going to do an updated traffic analysis based on the bike lanes and all of that?
So again, with our two build alternatives, the bike lanes are pushed outside the street. For the no build alternative that will have the bike lanes in the street, a traffic analysis will be performed.
And do we have a timeline on that yet?
That work is going to be, I guess, we're kind of jumping ahead in terms of schedule. That work will be occurring over this winter and spring with the goal of having results to share with everyone in the springtime.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate that, Debbie. Brian, you have a question?
Yes, hi. Brian Zelenko from the Tiltonwood neighborhood. I apologize, I joined about 15 minutes late, and so you maybe already addressed this, but I recall an earlier planning study showed this route going down Tuckerman Lane to Grosvenor Metro. Did that get changed at some point?
Yes, and we will post all the information, but that was part of our earlier steps we reviewed in terms of the termini screening. So, you know, Kate went through a detailed overview of, you know,
Okay.
the plans, the background. So we'll post that on the website, and then we can obviously follow up if you have any further questions. We'll be happy to answer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, any other questions on what we've covered so far before we get into next steps? All right,
Yes, Colin, do we want to run through some
Yeah, I
of the
was gonna
questions in
say,
the chat?
I'm seeing some questions in the chat here. So looks like Roger, I'm sorry, I noticed very brief reference to Tyson's connector. I assume this is referring to the Fairfax connector, Route 798 express bus service. Can you speak to how this is being considered in your plans? And on a side note, do you know anything about when that service will be launching? I cannot comment on the service launching, but I can certainly speak to how we are incorporating that, and I'm sure Lucas and Kate can as well. But yes, I mean, that connections to existing facilities and those types of things are absolutely something that are going to be involved in our alternatives analysis. And when we look at different criteria and how we're analyzing the different alternatives, Obviously, something that provides more connections and helps encourage ridership and things like that will be things we want to consider in terms of how we present and analyze those alternatives. Lucas, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, but.
Yeah, just to add on that, that is the service that we are referencing, and there have been questions, raised in the past of if there are opportunities to connect this service with that service coming from Tyson's to make a more streamlined connection beyond just the mall, and so continuing to North Bethesda.
All right, appreciate that. Michael, I see you've noted there will be 2 lanes in each direction on Old Georgetown Road, regardless of the decision, no build Alt 1 or Alt 2. In other words, nothing you decide will change the current tow lanes on Old Georgetown Road. Yes, as far as I know, that is a state highway project, so our project was not directly involved in that. But again, as we've kind of hit on here many times, we are certainly factoring that into our existing conditions analysis. So we will make sure that that's being analyzed in both our no build and all of our other alternatives. Got one from Karen here that says, how often would the BRT actually run to warrant even studying a dedicated lane for buses? So in terms of the travel times, I don't believe that's something we'd have nailed down at this point in our analysis. Lucas, do you want to talk about how we consider some of those things as we move forward?
Yeah, so as Montgomery County looks at BRT service, the general assumption is that the buses would run throughout the day at a minimum of 15-minute frequency. So coming every 15 minutes or more often. And so that is one of what we would look at in this corridor and look at those service levels.
Right. Just going back through, I see.
And sorry, just one more thing on that, Colin, is that this is maybe getting a little bit into the weeds, but depending on how the dedicated lanes are configured, there are options that other bus service that goes on the same streets could use the dedicated lanes. So there would be more buses that would be using the dedicated lanes than just this BRT service.
All right, appreciate that. Going back through, I think we've answered every other comment with the presentation, unless I'm missing any. So by all means, if I have not, please let me know. But are there any final questions in the chat or anyone who has a question before we jump to next steps? Okay, all right. Well, just want to wrap up here looking ahead. I appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to us and walk through what we've been working on over the past couple months. So basically, we are going to take all the feedback we've received tonight. We got a lot of comments in the chat. We've got a lot of questions we've noted and items we want to follow up on. So we are going to take that back, see how we need to incorporate that in our analysis as we work to build out these alternatives and work to analyze them. So that'll really be the crux of our work over the next several months, is diving more into these alternatives, really getting into how the typical sections and the alignments will look throughout the corridor, and then taking a look at each of them with our screening metrics that tie back to our corridor foundations, and seeing how each of them comes out when we complete that analysis. So we'll be working on that, and the goal would be to get that analysis done, summarize the results, and have something to present to our stakeholders after that process is complete. And I see a couple more questions coming in. So Vanna, when would you know if and when there will be another traffic study? I cannot comment to traffic studies that I'm aware of coming up by SHA or MCDOT. We will be looking at the traffic as part of one of the metrics we look at to analyze the different alternatives, but I don't know if that will be a full-fledged traffic study that you're looking for. So maybe we can, let me know if I need to clarify that more for you. We can take that offline. But and then Karen, I see key point of comments is even during rush hour, bus service from North Bethesda to Westfield takes only 12 minutes. So as someone who takes transit exclusively, I don't see the value of a dedicated bus lane, especially as a dedicated bus lane will have a negative impact on traffic flow. Appreciate that, Karen. So again, that's one of the things that these alternatives are meant to look at. And that's why we want to make sure we're considering, starting from no build to doing nothing to a variety of different alternatives, because, we don't want to build something that people aren't going to use and that isn't going to be effective for community members. So part of our analysis when looking at the service and the quality and the reliability of the transportation that we would provide if we built this BRT would be making sure it actually provides those types of improvements and is a difference maker for end users who want to use that. So let me know if that didn't answer your question. And then I see Silvana, you have another question. Hold on, let me see if can you unmute? Can you there?
Thank you. Thank you. And I'll be quick.
No problem.
Just the one note for you guys to take back that going back to the traffic study, the reason why we're just adamant about knowing whether we believe there should be a new traffic study that takes in consideration the new approved projects. Obviously, there's a lot that is approved in the area and the new bike lanes. Because if you're going to conduct the next step in the next 2-3 months for the alternative analysis, it seems like having recent traffic data with the changes that happened within the last month, that it would be judicious to take that in consideration, new traffic study versus the previous data that didn't really, that wouldn't really provide accurate information for this analysis of the alternative.
Yeah, and again, any traffic analysis that we're doing as part of our alternatives analysis is going to factor in that those bike lanes are there. So we want to make sure everything we're doing is up to date and based on the current existing condition as is. So whatever results we get, we know are tied to how it actually is out there and how things are actually performing now.
Thank you. And it would be super useful for us to know when that traffic study is going to be conducted, if there can be a release to the community or to the CAS so that we can then fill in our community members on when would that be happening. It would be great. Thank you. Thank you all.
Yep. All right. Any other final questions? I see a few comments. Appreciate everyone doing that, and we will take all those back. But any other last things, questions, clarifications before we adjourn? All right. Well, again, thank you all for coming out. I know it's a weeknight, so we appreciate everyone taking the time. We appreciate everyone's input. Thank you for your questions and comments. All of this information will be posted on the website, so please check into that as we'll continue to update everything. And then there are also ways on the website if you want to follow up, have additional questions or comments, please just let us know. And we look forward to following up as we get further into our alternatives analysis.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great night.